Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome back to You Are From God. We are going to have another episode, this time talking about Specks and Planks. And Scott, this conversation comes from Matthew chapter 7, the first 5 verses, where Jesus, in the middle of this sermon, is kind of offering just some very basic ways of how we interact with one another and the ways that we look at ourselves and the things that we deal with and the things that other people deal with and need to address. And that's a big thing that we're talking about so far on this program, is understanding that I'm from God, you are from God, and how I view myself and how I view you needs to be influenced by that. And so as children of God, it doesn't mean that we're perfect. There are going to be things that we need to correct, things that get in our eyes, so to speak, and that obstruct our view and our focus on Jesus, and that make it harder to see and that distract us. But Matthew 7, Jesus here is talking about the importance of understanding how we address that in one another, and importantly, holding ourselves not to different standards, but all one standard. So if you're listening along, we're going to be in Matthew 7. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. I encourage you to go again on your own time, maybe this week, and open it up and study this passage. Verse 1, "Judge not, that you not be judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." And so there's a lot going into this, Scott. Obviously, Jesus' point, the whole reason he brings up this, quite frankly, humorous illustration, is the idea that we judge one another. We've talked about this on a previous episode, but the idea that when I'm judging somebody, it needs to be done righteously, as Jesus will talk about, based on God's standards, what God says is right and wrong. Me being a hypocrite when I'm judging, which is what Jesus is talking about here, that hypocritical judgment, is when I'm deciding for myself what's right and what's wrong, and I'm holding other people to that standard, but I'm not necessarily holding myself to that standard. There's an expectation on others. Ultimately, for the illustration's sake, we're saying the log in my eye is not that big of a deal. It's ignorable. I don't have to think about it. It's just there. The speck in your eye is a big deal. It's a huge issue that we need to address. And that, quite frankly, is where the hypocrisy comes in, and just holding ourselves and other people to different standards that are not the same as God's standards.
And that's the amazing thing when you talk about being a funny illustration. That's absolutely what it is, except for it's so real, to your point. And it happens all the time. We can get so caught up in seeing what other people are doing and so blind to what we're doing, to your point, that it reminds us of Matthew the 23rd chapter, where Jesus gives 8 woes, basically telling them from a grief standpoint how he views them and that they're hypocrites. You know, they were trying to be leaders of men, but they were leading them in the wrong direction, and they were hypocrites for what they were doing. 27, as an example, says, "For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead man's bones and all uncleanness." And that's really what happens to us if we're not careful. Where on the outside you can look the part, but inside you're just full of dead men's bones. It's beautiful sometimes to go to a cemetery. You know, you can walk around, there's beautiful architecture, various things that are going on there. But the reality is, it's where we bury the dead. And that's what that place is for. And so I think we, again, understand the illustration and the imagery that Jesus is using. But right before that, he talks about the Pharisees and the scribes. In verse 23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel."
What's all these goofy illustrations that Jesus uses? They're powerful. They
Absolutely.
Get the point across.
Well, I think that's the thing, is they're so obvious. How can you talk about swallowing a camel? But from a spiritual standpoint, we can do this very quickly. We talk about, at least the way that I would describe this, is majoring in the minors. We focus on these minor things. Doesn't mean they're not important, but we major in them. We focus so much on them that we miss, as he talks about here, justice, mercy, faithfulness. All these things are so important. He gets on the Pharisees for this earlier in Matthew when he talks about the fact that they were not willing or not able to take care of their families because they were giving all their money to God and saying, look, we gave all our money to God. I can't take care of my parents. Well, he says that's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. You've got to understand the weightier matters, the things that we need to be doing when it comes to God, as he talks about here. The Pharisees struggled with it, but guess who else struggles with it? And so it's important for us to see a lot of times we're the one with the plank in our eyes, to the point that when you read in Matthew 7, and we're trying to take this little speck out of somebody else's eyes simply because it's just so much easier to see it in somebody else than it is in us.
Right, and that plank obviously is impairing how we see the situation. Jesus is ultimately calling us in Matthew 7 to have some introspection and self-examination first, and to figure out what that standard is before we start trying to apply what I think is best to other people, figuring out what that standard, what does a clean eye look like? If I don't see that, if I can't find that or see that in myself first, then I don't have the business going around helping others. Quite frankly, if I'm the person with the speck in my eye and you come along and you've got this log in your eye, like, why would you let me help you with that speck? I imagine as Jesus explains it in Matthew 7, like the guy comes up, let me take the speck out of your eye. And the guy's like hitting him over the head with the log that's coming out of his eye. Like, why would I let you help me if you're clearly not applying the principles and advice that I'm trying to prescribe to you to my own situation? Like, you're trying to help me with my eyes? Dude, what are you talking about? And so that's what it comes down to, Scott. We're trying to do our best to strive to live by the standard that Jesus gives. We're not trying to make up our own standards of what we think is best and then determining who should or shouldn't be accountable to those things. We are all accountable. We're all striving to live by Jesus' standards. This is one of the frustrating things, if I can just be frank with you for a minute, Scott, that people will talk about, well, is it right for a Christian to do X? That's the wrong question. If it's wrong for a Christian to do something, it's wrong for a human to do something. God wants all people to be saved. He calls us all to the same standard. We're all accountable to him, and he wants us all to be right with him. You know what that means? It means being a Christian. And so when you talk about, well, is it right for a Christian to do this? What you're really wanting to ask, what we need to be thinking about is it right for anybody to do this? So that it's not this standard of, well, specks and planks with Christians or non-Christians. No, we're all held accountable. What God calls a plank, it's a plank. What God calls a speck, it's a speck. Now, that doesn't negate the importance of the speck, and that's something we need to really pay attention to. If I'm the guy with the speck in Jesus' illustration, I'm not exempt from correcting my issue just because the person or multiple people who come to me have logs sticking out of their eyes. At the end of the day, it's like, I've got something irritating my eye and it's making it harder to see, but all these goofballs are coming along and they've got these huge issues, and then we start comparing, well, I'm not as bad as them, so I'm totally fine. The thing with both Matthew 7 and Matthew 23 is Jesus will use the illustration. You need to start with yourself first, then you can do these other things. So in Matthew 7, it's first take the log out of your own eye, hold yourself to the God standards, make sure you're living in this light, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Matthew 23 with the gnat and the camel, it's a similar thing where Jesus will say in verse 23, these, talking about the dill and the mint and the cumin, you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Like this idea of you're focusing on these minor things, that doesn't mean you don't tithe dill and mint and cumin. Those are great things, but you're straining out this gnat and swallowing the camel. You need to make sure you're paying attention to those things so that the little things do get done. You are able to help others genuinely, but it has to start someplace. And so it starts with self-evaluating and ultimately just having a love for God, that I want to live by his standard, and a love for other people, that I genuinely want to help them, that I show them that I care for their soul, and that I understand, look, I've had stuff in my eyes too. This is how I took care of the situation. I've had bigger things in my eyes, so to speak. And I would love to help us all have this clear vision, our eyes that are clear and then locked on following Jesus.
And I think that's such an important point. When you talk about anything that is foreign in your eye is going to cause problems. Mm-hmm. But if your comparison is to other people and say, well, at least my eyes aren't that bad, that's the wrong standard to the point that you're making. And it's about my relationship with God. And the whole purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus saying, you're going to have a relationship with God, but it's going to be seen in your relationship with other people, how you treat other people. And really, when we're talking about helping somebody else that's going through something difficult and making sure that I have the right relationship to be able to help other people, I think of various passages. You think of Galatians, the 6th chapter, will talk about carrying somebody else's burden and really understanding that. But chapter 5 ends by saying, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And so it's the idea of us putting on these things and trying to help one another, rather than, as verse 26 says, let us not become boastful, challenging one another, envying one another, as happens to a lot of people. It's having that relationship with him and truly having it seen in other people, that we're willing to live that life. Tyler, to me, 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, comes up so many times when we talk about our relationship with other people. The danger, and people at West Mason know this, the danger sometimes is that we only use this passage when we're talking about marriage, which has nothing specifically to do with this passage. It's about love. It's a beautiful passage to read for a marriage. That's fine. But we miss the point that this is talking about my relationship with brothers and sisters that I'm around. And so he'll talk about all these different pieces about love and the need for love. But in verse 4, he says, love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, rejoices all things, endures all things. Love never fails. You think about some of these pieces, though. Am I willing to be patient with not only my wife, but a member of the congregation that I go to? Am I showing the patience that I need? Am I being kind to people that maybe aren't being kind to me? But am I also not taking into account a wrong suffered? Am I keeping track of what people have done to me? Or am I rejoicing in unrighteousness? When somebody does something wrong, when they're walking around with a plank, am I rejoicing in the fact of what they are doing is wrong, rather than trying to help them because I'm the one that needed help to begin with, and I can help other people do the same thing because of my love for them, because of my love for God. And if we have that attitude and we understand that we're children of God and we have the ability to help other people as children of God, what a beautiful thing that is if it's done. The danger is, to the point that you've made, talking about Matthew 7, there's a lot of people walking around with planks in their eyes, and there's a lot of people walking around with specks in their eyes. When the reality is we need to make sure that we get our eyes clear and full of light, as Jesus will go on to say, and make sure that we have that kind of relationship with him.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Again, this standard is love. I'm thinking about John's epistles, 1 John, 2 John in particular, just because I've studied that recently, where he'll talk about, this is the commandment. It's new just because it's under this new covenant, but it's the one we've had from the beginning. It's the one God's always called us to, as we've talked again about in previous episodes. It's to love one another. In those passages, John will actually make it equal with the idea of how you love one another. You love other people by walking in Christ. In other words, you obey his commandments. You love God, you love other people, you walk in his commandments. All these things are necessarily intertwined. And so when I'm walking myself in that way, when I'm holding myself to the pattern of New Testament teaching, that's when I'm truly going to be able to love genuinely and being able to play out this situation as Jesus says is the best. First, take the log out of your own eye. Start with yourself. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. You'll see clearly to know when to be gentle. You'll be able to see clearly of when it needs a little bit more tough love, as we might say sometimes. You'll be able to see clearly about what the right timing might be and how to approach these things, and maybe some other people that might be good to come along to help take that speck out because they've had a similar speck in their eye, even if I haven't. And so ultimately, this is all motivated of this place in love. And so that's the standard, not one of hypocrisy and judging based on what I think is best, but about the love that God sets, that he has for us and that he desires us to have for one another. So if you're listening to this, maybe you have a plank in your eye and you don't even know it yet. I encourage you to take some time. We're encouraging you to take the time this week to just look at some hard passages in Scripture, spend some time in the Gospels, look at the New Testament, find those places that have made you uncomfortable, and go and read and really spend some time thinking about, is this a plank in my eye? Have I tried to help other people with this situation? And I haven't taken care of my own house, put my own house in order first before helping other people with this. Heed the words of Jesus and being able to take the plank out of your own eye first. That will take some work. It might take some time, but it's what he calls us to do. Maybe you're listening to this and you've got a speck in your eye, and you've had people that have come along and you have written them off just because they've got planks in their eye. Why in the world would I listen to them? Look, we've all got our own issues. Obviously, we all have the things that we need to work on. The side of the equation that you're on, even if it's just a speck, I have some things that I should change, but that's not nearly as bad as other people I worship with or that I work with. Look, this isn't about other people at that point. This is about your relationship with God. If somebody in love and in best intentions has brought something up to you that might need to be changed or adjusted or addressed in your life, just hear them out. And ultimately, don't just take their word for it. Good old reading rainbow, right? Don't take my word for it. Go to the scriptures, open the book, and see what God has to say on the matter. His is the standard we're striving to live by so that we can all have clear eyes, that we can all see each other and ourselves and God for the reality of things, to understand that you are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.